So, question to you, Julian, and to you as well, Peter. How would you then, in a sort of conceptual way, make a selection between the other disciplines that you would want to use in order for, that you would want to use as an externality in order for a different look on a problem, or maybe you have an example, for instance, of to give us of that conceptualization.
Maybe we can collect a few questions and then we can respond.
Thank you very much for very enlightening conceptual explanations. I have my own experience with the Commission, having worked there in the delegations and here in Brussels, of course. Now I'm with SEPS, so I have the outside view. I was missing a little bit the differences between competence of the EU or not member states, because there, of course, there's a different representation to the outside. So the idea of supranationality was missing a little bit, particularly on the legal side. And as well, I had the experience in Japan when we changed actually from being only one of the international organizations to being what we called on the other side of the pink sheet. That means being recognized as a fully established diplomatic mission. And it was quite interesting how de facto things change, more than de jure only. I think this is important as well, that we have to see, because you talked about descriptive means, have to see how de facto the EU is acting, not only de jure. I think this is important to emphasize here. Thank you.
You started the presentation out with the slides of the 3 generations, and in the 3rd generation, what does the EU achieve? Like in my studies of accountancy, I learned that it's basically a relatively recent development to look at international organization and what they achieve instead of just what they do. And is it something that you found also in your research, or is it really that, like in the last decades, it's always been that there are basically those 3 generations that you can find in basically any international organization?
Okay. The first question was addressed to Peter and Julian. Maybe Peter, you would like to start?
Thanks very much for the question. About the selection of other disciplines, if I understood it correctly, which disciplines would I select to look at to find inspiration for the conceptualization of a concept? Well, I think we shouldn't be too limitative. We shouldn't exclude other disciplines. We should have a very broad perspective. And the first criteria is does that discipline also speak about or study the same concept? That's the first thing. It shouldn't be necessarily the same word or the same concept, but simply the same phenomenon which has been labeled differently could also be relevant. And it's not always that is relevant at first sight. Sometimes it's only relevant at a more abstract level. So I don't think we should exclude other disciplines. We should take a look as broad as possible to include other disciplines. Even biology can be interesting. For example, in global governance, we see a proliferation of organizations, international organizations, international regimes that may resemble, for example, the evolution of organisms and niches in biology, for example. So that could be very interesting to see how those more biological ideas and assumptions may be relevant to the EU or global governance. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I will just second what Peter said, and I think there is no particular rule how can you navigate through different disciplines. I think it should all depend on your personal judgment as a researcher, and of course on your research that you're doing in your case study. But indeed, there are many good examples where of this sort of interdisciplinary traveling. When Peter mentioned biology, it just came to my mind that one of the typical methods that we use in social sciences, process tracing. For example, the latest generation of scholars try to conceptualize process tracing, basically taking indeed the definition of mechanisms that biological mechanisms, and giving it basically translating it to social sciences. Process tracing as an entities and activities that work together. So I would say the broader you cast the net, the better.
Thanks a lot. I will address the question of the gentleman of SEPS. By the way, SEPS is a very interesting consultancy firm. So if you're doing research on this topic, also consult their website. They have reports coming out every couple of weeks, and they're doing pretty great work. So it's not a firm. It's a it's an NGO. An NGO. Well, but they're doing fantastic work. But as regard to the question, I didn't tackle questions on recognition of the EU, when the EU speaks up, when it can do so, and when it can't. Because for my research, I'm not actually studying these kind of things, the division of competences and how it reflects in the international world. Most of the lawyers studying the topic are doing that, and I guess it would even have fit better in the EU performance kind of discussion. For example, things and when can the High Representative explain her views in front of the Security Council, these kind of things. The difference between the delegation to the WTO and what they can do within the WTO compared to the other delegation in Geneva. Very interesting, but I'm not actually looking at that per se. I'm more looking at way more basic stuff. Things like when a member of the EU delegation causes a traffic accident, for example, what would be the consequences? What are the legal problems and how the solutions? And there, it doesn't really matter whether that's a person in the EU delegation to the WTO, to the UN in Geneva, because the legal situation is more or less the same. So it's very interesting, but it's not really my field, so I can't really say much more about it.
Thank you very much all for your questions. To start with the question on supranationality, or more the comment you made that we didn't really address that, and it's indeed very important for the EU's role in different international organizations, because I know from the field of environmental policy that there the European Union participates in a lot of conventions. So, for example, the Convention on Climate Change, on Biological Diversity. And there it has a special status as a regional economic integration organization. And this status is, the European Union is the only actor that fulfills these criteria to participate as such in environmental conventions. And it means that the EU is really a sui generis actor, and it's not recognized as a member in each organization, the international organization. And so in some fields, also like in the United Nations, in the General Assembly, the EU still has to fight for getting a better status. And with the Lisbon Treaty, the EU has received legal personality, so it means that now it's the European Union that represents it's the European Union, no longer the European Community that it was before, that is a party to different conventions and other organizations. And then the difference between de jure and de facto. Yeah, that's also where you see the interaction between the disciplines of law and political science. That the law, it's which rules are out there, and as Sandra also says, it's not so much then looking into what are the effects of these rules, but it's more descriptive, normative. And then political science takes that a step forward to say, okay, how are these rules then in practice being applied? And sometimes the rules are not even applied in practice because some member states don't want it, or so. And then looking into case studies, it can be very interesting to see how do law and practice interact. And you asked a question about the different generations of research on EU performance, and in international organizations, to what extent is there literature on each organization of the three generations? I think what the EU is, that first generation, is actually quite was a quite broad overview that scholars made of the EU's presence in different fields. So it was already each issue area. So I think that literature was not so much specifically looking at organizations, but more each area of where the EU was active, for example, trade, environment. What is the EU there trying to do? Is it then a civilian kind of actor in terms of its development policy, these kind of things? The second generation, what the EU does, there are quite a lot of articles mentioned in that list that are on environment policy, but also some on human rights, on trade, and this Niemann and Brotherton, this special issue of a journal. In these kind of special issues, it's quite common that they address many different areas, so then also many different organizations. But I am sure that there are some issue areas that are not so often studied as others. For example, environmental policies is studied a lot because the EU is such an important actor and trying to be a front runner in that area. But maybe arms trade, as what you study, is a bit less studied area. So yeah, and then this third generation, what the EU achieves, there you also see a special issue, and there also it's quite broad, trying to address all the different organizations.
I think it's also important to understand that these three generations are sort of ideal types, right? So if we talk about third generation now, it doesn't mean that the research on what the EU is or what the EU does stopped. No, it's all actually still going on in parallel. So there are even now books that and special issues that discuss still the issue: what power is the EU, what kind of power, or develop further the notion of EU actorness. So these three generations of literature should be rather perceived as three layers that are evolving and developing at the same time in parallel.
To build on that, I think these three generations are also it's kind of logical. First, you need to know what an organization is. That's also typical for the EU because it's a strange animal. So a lot of questions were about what is it? Is it a normative power? Is it a civilian power? So first logical question is what is it? Then what does it? What does it do? And only after you know what it does, you can ask the question. What it does it do it effectively? Does it the thing it does, is that what it also has been stated as a goal initially? So I think there's a logical order, but as Julian says, research on what the EU is or what an organization is still continues because the EU also transforms. But I think there's a general order. If I can say something on the competence issue, the competencies and the distribution between competences between the EU and its member states always come up when it comes to representation and how the EU behaves in international institutions. And I think it's important. It really has explanatory value there. But when I studied EU coordination and internal coordination process for G20, G7, and G8, I also considered competences as one of the possible explanations to explain why coordination differs significantly. I found that competences does not really play a role, at all, especially for G7, G8 and G20. Why? Because the G20 discusses issues regardless of the competences, or the distribution of competences within the EU. For example, financial supervision or financial regulations are in the different competences regimes, if I can say it like that. But the G20, or within the G20, the members do not say, well, let's discuss now financial supervision because that's the EU competence, and then we will discuss financial regulation, which is a member state competence. But more importantly, with regard to coordination, the member states and the EU institutions who sit together to coordinate the common position, even non-binding, for those G20 finance ministerial meetings, they don't say, well, now we just share information on financial regulation because it's a member state issue, and then we try to come up with a common position because it's financial supervision, which is a EU competence. So it's a very important aspect when it comes to representation and the behavior of the EU internationally, but I found that with regard to EU coordination, it doesn't really play a role. So I just want to add that.
Are there more questions from the audience? Well, if not, it's also almost 8 o'clock, so then I just want to thank everybody for your attendance and wish you a good evening.